summer 2007, and Britain was hit by some of the worst flooding in recorded history in this country. Now, torrential rain caused water tables to rise suddenly, and low-lying parts of the west of England, such as here in Tewkesbury, were particularly badly hit. So here I am now, standing next to the river at Tewkesbury. Now, its level rose so quickly that it burst its banks and forced 1,800 households into temporary accommodation. So while a majority of people returned home fairly fast, more than 200 were still living in temporary accommodation a year later. Now, 70 of them were put up in caravans. 18 months on, and 6 households continue to live in those caravans. So we are here in Tewkesbury to find out what life is like 5 years on, and ask, if this were to happen again now, would insurance pay for rebuild and restoration? So your house flooded
just on the road. Yes.
So just tell me about that flooding. What was ruined in your house?
Everything in the ground floor. About £30,000 worth of stuff, really. It was only later one realised that it was going to cost you a lot more in insurance, and the house value had dropped by a third. All the floors needed replacing, the garden needed completely restoring, the kitchen was destroyed, all the furniture downstairs was destroyed. Well, that's about it, really. Yeah.
So a lot of work.
Yeah, quite a lot.
Yeah. Well, up at Morrison's, you've got the traffic lights, haven't you?
Yeah.
And my son walked along on the Saturday morning because he couldn't get out to go to work. And he come back, he said, I've never seen anything like it, Mum. He said, there's a big articulated lorry and all you can see is the top of the cab.
That just shows how deep it was. What about the damage to property?
Well, the town had it.
Yes, all along here. It was, I don't know, because we came back about a week later. When
nobody could get in or out of Tewkesbury.
No. And it was just
cut off.
Just a horrible sort of feeling. Yeah, of sort of, I don't know, the atmosphere had changed, hadn't it, really? Yeah. And a lot of these shops were all very badly damaged, weren't they?
Weeks before they opened.
Yes,
weeks was it?
Oh, yes, long time. Yes, yeah.
And some of them never reopened?
No.
No. And we had people who were flooded out and lost all their wares, really, all their.
Just tell me about some of the people you know who had that happen to them.
Well, it was through work, so I can't really say very much. But they certainly had. They were moved around the county, really, out of Tewkesbury.
Well, I worked with a lady that lived up near the school, going towards the motorway, and she lived in a caravan outside her house for nearly 2 years, and in the end, her husband didn't survive it.
Oh.
Well, initially, as you can imagine, people are very concerned and confused after a flooding event. You get this terrible swathe of floodwater coming into your property. Unfortunately, it brings mud and dirt with it, I'm afraid, as well. And so there's an element of not knowing what to do, and that's where our industry really comes in. In the few hours after the flooding, our emergency teams came into Tewkesbury and started helping shop owners and business owners and also residential homes.
So what sort of technology would they have brought in? We'll be seeing this later.
Yes, well the first thing, and in some ways most obvious, is they come in with water extraction equipment, pumps and wet vacuuming equipment to actually suck out as much of the water from a premises as possible and clean up the mud and silt to help with bacterial contamination. Once that initial phase is over and the building is in a more stable state, then we come in with different types of drying equipment, different types of dehumidifiers, which, as you say, we'll have a look at later on, to help bring buildings back to a moisture level which is appropriate following a flooding event.
There was a lot of damage happened straight after that flooding. What about the damage that sort of happens after the actual flood itself? Does that happen?
It can do. That's what we refer to as secondary damage. The primary damage is, of course, the flood itself, and unfortunately there's nothing we can do to have stopped that. But in the hours and days after a flood, when a building is very, very wet, you can suffer from secondary damage, and that would be things like fabrics or books and things starting to go mouldy. Even building materials, plaster for example, can exhibit mould growth very quickly after a flooding event.
And also, I suppose, with any building, it's the smell that you've got to get rid of, isn't it? That smell can go on if it's not treated properly.
That's right, and what you're smelling there is effectively the products from the floodwater being broken down by the bacteria that the floodwater has brought in. So our industry pays a lot of close attention to what we call multi-cleaning, where we'll actually clean through let's say it's a shop premises, for example, carry out testing to see what bacterial contamination is left, and if there is still contamination, then obviously cleaning again with disinfectant to ensure that bacterial contamination is resolved. Once you've got rid of that and got bacteria levels down to a normal level, what you'd expect in a premises, then that smell should abate.
Also, many people had to move out of their homes, and some were left living in temporary accommodation, even caravans, for a year plus after that. What sort of things would have been going on with those sort of properties a year afterwards? Right.
Well, in some respects, that's a great shame, of course, if people have to move out of their properties and be out for that length of time. What normally is happening is there can be a delay between the drying works firstly being completed, and then obviously reinstatement contractors, builders coming in to reinstate plasterboard walls, for example. What our industry has really been trying to focus on is preventing that long delay by ensuring that the drying techniques we use, things like envelope drying, injection drying, prevent the need for so much strip out of properties, and therefore prevent the need for so much reinstatement. And really that's helping to reduce claim times overall.
And what sort of things have we learnt about dealing with these big floods, these flooding occasions, since that time 5 years ago?
Well, there's been a lot of development in the industry. We've been working towards new educational standards, making sure that contractors involved in fire and flood restoration work really are at the top of their game, and that the qualifications that they require to be able to work in the industry ensure that the appropriate actions are taken in the appropriate order. That way we don't end up with, for example, too much strip out occurring in a property, and meaning that families end up trying to live in caravans for up to 2 years, which is really no good for anybody.
Now, just tell me about your memories of that day when the floods hit Tewkesbury.
Well, the thing is, it just came all of a sudden. On the car park to start with, there was a little bit of water down the bottom. Then a few days later, the whole car park was completely underwater.
And when you say underwater, how deep was it?
Well, there was a mark on the door which was up to about there on the old hut I had there before, but it's gone now. So, and we were literally, I bought a flat around the corner there, and we literally waded in and out knee deep to get in and out of our flats.
Okay, so I mean, what sort of change to your life immediately happened? What did you have to do to, resolve the situation?
Well, just try to carry on as normal, and basically there was nothing to do because I couldn't come to work because obviously the car park was underwater. So what I did most of the time was, because there was water things around, people was going to get bottles of water, so I basically, to keep myself occupied, I went and got water for the old ladies that live over there, plus the old ladies that live down the road there.
And just tell me about some of the shops that you saw. What did they look like? Because some were quite badly flooded.
Oh, some of the shops inside were like carpets, and I mean, especially the bakery over the road there, the restaurant over the road there, that was virtually a write-off for about a year and a half till it was all put right.
It was the worst nightmare ever. We couldn't get back to Sledge Green. Everywhere was flooded. Police were turning us back. We couldn't get through Upton. We couldn't get through Ledbury. No. Everywhere, and we finished up by driving under the bridge on the A438. Yeah. In my little car, and all the cars were stuck in it. They were just trapped. And my little car went straight through and managed to get home. Yeah.
Just tell me about some of the properties you saw. What had happened to them?
Oh,
it was terrible. Terrible.
This was the worst. They were having to send the army in, weren't they, to get the assistants out of the shops. Yeah. All of the high street. Oh, and the poor church. Poor Abbey, that was dreadful. Yeah.
What happened there?
It was completely flooded.
There was cars submerged. You could just see the roads,
It was completely flooded. And the only thing they rescued from the church was what they call the baby Jesus. Everything else, the manger, everything was flooded.
So we've heard from people who've been affected in Tewkesbury and that their houses and shops were flooded out. Now let's look at some of the equipment that Richfords uses to deal with premises such as those.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got a bit of a range of the equipment here that typically people might expect to see in properties after flooding. I suppose we'll start with the most obvious, which would be the refrigerant dehumidifiers here. They come in various sizes. You see a larger one down the back there, and this is really sort of the backbone of our industry in many respects. It's a high capacity dehumidifier, obviously helps reduce the humidity in a property and start to get it dried out after a flooding event. The other thing that customers might see, as well as those though, are these smaller red units, which are known as a desiccant dehumidifier. They produce very, very dry air that we use with some of the specialist drying systems we've mentioned, such as injection drying and envelope drying, which is designed for saving more building elements such as plasterboard, plaster ceilings, and those sorts of things. In fact, we've got a little run of the injection drying system here. It's a very, very simple system. It gets connected to these desiccant dehumidifiers, and these little nozzles will actually introduce dry air inside a cavity behind plasterwork, saving it. The key benefit there being the plasterboard doesn't have to be removed or replaced, reducing the overall claims time, and therefore not seeing these situations in the future where people have to spend up to 2 years living in caravans. This sort of system prevents that from having to happen.
And you've got, there's this little grey contraption down here.
Yes, indeed. This is quite an interesting little unit. This is something that wasn't available actually in 2007. This is something that's been developed since that major flooding event. This is a remote monitoring device. One of the things that customers often felt or fed back to our industry that they felt made them feel sort of more nervous during the restoration process is they didn't know where they were. How's it going? You know, I've had this drying equipment in the property for so long, but is it really starting to have an effect? What these remote monitors do is they have a humidity sensor on the bottom, so you can drill a hole, for example, in a concrete floor that you're trying to dry, and the unit will actually send a text message every 12 hours or so with the humidity readings in that floor. That way the customer can actually log into an internet browser and actually see how the drying is getting along in their property. Thus, a bit like tracking your parcel, for example. You can log in and see where it's at. These units are now allowing us to do that.
And what other equipment we got here?
Well, without the dehumidifiers do a great job, but they can't do the whole job on their own. You also need air movement in a property to increase the rate of evaporation. It's a bit like blowing across the top of your cup of tea. If you don't have that air movement, the liquid can't evaporate. So also we use various types of blowers. Here's a small one here. Again, this has got an adapted nozzle on, so it can be run also using with the injection drying. But you'll see a number of these in a property. If you've got 2 or 3 dehumidifiers, you might have up to 6 or 7 blowers creating air movement. As I say, they come in various shapes and sizes, so there are some larger units like these snail blowers, for example, that also are used to increase the air movement around a property and therefore speed up the rate of evaporation.
And behind you?
Behind us, yeah, this is one of the larger water extraction units and also a carpet cleaning unit. There are various forms of these, and you may see all sorts of different types during a flooding event, but essentially they all do the same job, which is extract that dirty water from carpets. If the carpets can be saved, then also they can be used obviously to shampoo those carpets. In many cases it's really a temporary measure to get as much liquid water out as possible, and then actually obviously those carpets may be written off anyway. But really this is probably one of the first things you might see following a flooding event.
Just tell me what happens the day the floods happen. What happened to your restaurant?
Well, as I live above it, it was about 5:30 in the morning, and my neighbour from 2 doors down, there was this banging and banging on the door, and I thought, oh my God, so I never come down, so I just opened up my windows, and he's standing there and his feet are in water, and he said, Leslie, I think we're in trouble, because normally we do have floods because it's a floodplain, but they normally stay that side of the road, and slowly but surely it was coming across the road. And at that time the pavement was being done as well, so luckily there were lots of sand there, so we broke down the barrier, got all sorts of plastic bags. We tried to sandbag the front because we could see it was coming up. This was about 6:30, 7 o'clock. It actually started to lap over here. It actually only came about over the pavement about 2 inches, and we could have kept it out, but unfortunately, as we have a basement, it was 2 inches but 8 foot an 8-foot indoor swimming pool. So that was a bit of a disaster. And then we didn't really quite know what to do. We didn't know it was coming at all. It was a complete surprise.
So what happened in the week after that for your business? What happens to try and rectify the situation?
Well, actually, in all fairness, first of all, we didn't have any water and electricity, of course. Everything went out. And the water board, the Severn Trent Water, were very good. And we were also contacted immediately by, I'm not quite sure who they were. It wasn't the council, but it was some government agency with emergency money if you needed it. They just came and had a look. It was a simple piece of paper. It wasn't loads and loads and loads of things to fill in. It was very, very simple. But unfortunately, because everybody was affected, we had a great deal of trouble getting builders and things. And of course, when the builders did come in, they did very well. And it took 6 weeks just to dry the place out because it's so old, and to get the basement dried and everything, and then it all had to be dug out because it was foul water. We had to replace all the floors, all the plaster fell off the walls. We were closed until November. Some places were closed for even longer, but we managed to get open by November, but it was pretty hard going. And it was very quiet around here for a while.
Just tell me about the insurance as well.
Well, I was lucky because I had a good insurance company and I was covered for loss of profits and everything. So all the time I was closed, I was covered for the basic outgoing. So it didn't actually cost me any money, which was fortunate. But a lot of people, if you didn't have a good insurance, actually those were the first people on the site with the insurance assessors, these professional companies that come in and say, okay, we can help you. And in fact, I did employ one for 4% or something, and he was great. He took the whole problem off my hands. He negotiated with the insurance company. They came and inspected everything, and they were very good. They were very good.
So if, God forbid,
no,
this so you couldn't get insured now?
No, I couldn't get. I think some people have managed to. But I'm self-insuring for a few years because I was paying about £1,500 to insure it, and I got a quote of £7,000, for insurance for a year. I mean, that was completely out of the question. So I'm merely a self-insurer now. I would say in some ways it did me a favour. In other ways, if I wanted to sell, I'd probably have to forget it for the next 5 or 6 years, because the first thing anyone asks is, did you flood? So we just have to keep our fingers crossed.
So you've heard anecdotally from several people in Tewkesbury, they're having problems in getting insurance cover since 2007.
That's right. Like Leslie, who we spoke to earlier, unfortunately, since the major flooding event in 2007, it has become more difficult to purchase insurance for both business premises and homes. And where policies have been available, significantly more expensive than in the past.
So this is a massive challenge going forward for not just the insurance market, but for the whole country and the government to look at.
Well, that's right. As you can imagine, insurance companies spent a significant amount of money. In fact, it was around £2.2 billion spent in 2007 on flood restoration. That's both here in Tewkesbury and in Hull, that was flooded as well that year. And therefore the insurance industry is looking to the government to assist them with helping avoid those sorts of expenses in the future. There's an agreement in place between the government and the insurance industry called the Statement of Principles, which, put in simple terms, is an agreement which states that the insurance industry will continue to provide flood cover as long as the government continue to spend money on flood defences. Now, unfortunately, in the economic climate that we're in, the government are having to reduce what they're spending across the board, and flood defence, unfortunately, is one of those areas that could be hit by spending cuts, and therefore potentially this Statement of Principles could lapse this year, which would mean insurance companies would stop providing flood insurance, and therefore we would see many more people like Leslie who are finding it difficult to find insurance. Some reports suggest up to 150,000 homes and properties in the UK would be uninsurable against flood damage if the Statement of Principles lapses.
So we've looked back 5 years to see how Tewkesbury was devastated by the flooding, and looked also at what is happening today with how the restoration industry has changed and some of the problems facing people in finding insurance cover. So the question is, if an event like 2007 happens again, how will communities cope, and what needs to happen to help people put their lives back together?